Well, hello to all of those who may be tuning in to this webinar, Can You Ever Go Home Again? My name is Jordan El, and I am an editor at the Markaz Review, which is organizing this based on our 50th issue. This is the beginning of our fifth year publishing the Markaz Review, and we're happy that we're still around. So, of course, we're a literary arts publication that grew out of a cultural center for the Middle East and North Africa, which we now call the center of the world. So we don't like to use those terms like the greater Middle East anymore, just to annoy our friends at the CIA. We publish primarily in English, but we try to translate as often as we can. We translate from French, Arabic, Persian. We've also translated from Kurdish and Turkish and Dari. And we look forward to translating from other languages. So you're welcome to check out the Markaz Review at themarkaz.org if you've never read it. And tonight's panel, we're going to talk about, can we ever really go home again? Our returning home theme. And this is moderated by our senior editor at the Markaz Review, Lina Munzer, who just returned to Beirut after quite an absence. So Lina, let me turn it over to you, and I'll come back later on, maybe with a question or two. And thank you
All
all.
right. Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you, everybody, for being here, whoever is attending tonight's talk. So we do these roundtables once a month for each of our issues. And the theme for this May issue that we're talking about is returning home. And it's actually pretty special because it's our 50th issue. And we were discussing, what theme we would have for the 50th issue, and we wanted something that would somehow be worthy of that number, of that anniversary number. And returning home is if you have read the issue, if you look at everything that our writers have contemplated, the idea of home is explored in various different ways, as an imaginary place, as a physical place, as a longing, as a cultural heritage, as as the place that we are constantly rejected by, or the place that we ourselves are rejecting in an effort to kind of find ourselves again. And it just seemed like such a big and rich theme. And it is something that obviously everybody contemplates, because home then becomes a metaphor for who we are and where we come from and where we hope to return to. And so we have three writers today who we've invited to our roundtable. We have Mai Al-Nakib, Gabriel Polley, and Nafeesa Syeed. And they are here to talk about their particular pieces. So I'm going to just say, give a bio and talk a little bit about their pieces. So Mai Al-Nakib is the author of the novel An Unlasting Home. Her award-winning collection of short stories, The Hidden Light of Objects, will be reissued by Saki Books UK in June 2025. Her short stories, poems, and occasional essays have appeared in, among others, professor. She taught English and comparative literature at Kuwait University for 20 years. She now writes full-time in Kuwait. May's piece is entitled Home is Elsewhere, on the Fictions of Return, and she talks about home as the place of longing, or longing itself as a place of home. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that connects to the idea of fiction and literature and the way we construct the imaginary place that we come from. And then we have Gabriel Polley, who completed his PhD in Palestine Studies in the European Center for Palestine Studies, University of Exeter, UK in 2020, under the supervision of Professor Ilan Pape and Dr. Nadia Nasser Najab. He previously studied history of art and literature at the University of East Anglia, UK, and Palestine and Arabic studies at Birzeit University, and taught in the occupied West Bank. He currently works in London in the translation and international development sectors. Palestine in the Victorian Age is his first book. And Gabriel's, the piece that he wrote for us is entitled Arabic Jazz and Yazz Ahmed, a music between homelands. And he interviews in it the British-Bahraini jazz musician Yazz Ahmed. who talks about the various different influences of where she comes from and how they come together in her music. And last but certainly not least, we have Nafeesa Syeed, or Saeed actually, who is a writer and editor. She's also a lecturer and associate research scholar at Yale. And she wrote a piece called A Kashmiri in Kashmere, which is just, it's, I hope everybody has read it because it's just a very expansive, very huge piece that kind of discusses so many various layers of colonialism, of where we come from, of imagination of home, of longing. And, I think that I would like to start with this piece, Nafeesa, actually, because so many of the other issues that come up, in the other two pieces, you have this essentially like this big map or this key in your piece, toward them. And I found especially a lot of similarity in your piece and May's piece. And so can you talk a little bit first, like give a little bit of an introduction about, you come from Kashmir, you hear about this town called Kashmir in Washington State, and you decide to visit there. And what I found really interesting is, even though this is kind of a minor detail in the piece, but then you find out that somebody who was related to you, I believe your aunt or somebody who had also made the same journey for the same reason, intrigued about this place. And so you're hoping to find something that reminds you of Kashmir. And it's not exact, and you do find that, but it's not exactly what you thought it would be in the first place. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The impetus for the trip really was the fact that there was a town named Kashmir after Kashmir. I had heard about it about 15 years ago. I had been based in South Asia as a journalist, and I had done a series on arts and culture amid conflict, kind of a safe enough topic, out of Kashmir. So I'd written, a lot, and had found out about this town through that. And so, a lot of those pieces and other kind of cultural pieces I've written, might look at a small community or place and sort of illuminate, that place or culture or whatever it might be, or something interesting. Uh, and I thought this was going to be that kind of piece where it's kind of this funny story about this town, that because on its website it says, proudly states that it was named after the Vale of Kashmir, made famous through British writers and things like that during colonialism. So in any case, I had always wanted to go there the last 15 years. And so I finally thought, okay, let me make this trip. And so I spent a week there, flew to Seattle and then drove there. It's about 2 hours east of Seattle. And I'd never even been to the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, I ended up going there, thinking, like I said, that it was just going to be, about this town, and seeing if maybe, going in already with the premise of, oh, what connections are there? What will I recognize? Or just, will I feel a sense of belonging because it's named after Kashmir, and thinking that for the first time, having lived in the US, maybe I will actually feel a sense of belonging, because this place, and there are a lot of other towns in the US with names like, East Palestine, Lebanon. I remember that's how they pronounce it, Lebanon. After Lebanon, there's a Persia, Iowa. So there's a Mahomet, Illinois, I think. So there are these little towns that have sort of interesting connections, with Asia, Sawana, all these different regions. And so I thought, like I said, it was just going to be that kind of connection. And so it was just very interesting, as I talk about in the essay. And what I wanted to establish in terms of writing was right away establish the point of view of as a diasporic Kashmiri going to this place, and sort of the real anticipation and sentimentality that already sort of pervades that point of view. And I had not, I mean, I've written, as a journalist for the last 20 years, but I have not often inserted myself into the story. So that was also something in the writing that was unexpected. But just in terms of, how the story changed what I thought it might be, was finding the layers of the history, where they got the name Kashmir, where they heard about Kashmir. And we could talk more about this, but there's a couple of characters that I sort of look at in the piece. There's a judge who hears about the name from the famous poem by Thomas More called Lalla Ruh, and sort of this romanticized version of Kashmir in the 19th century. They plucked that name, changed the name of the town in 1904. But the longer I was there, I realized that actually the moment that they decided to name it and chose the name, to name it after Kashmir, was also the very active removal of the indigenous peoples, the Wenatchee or Piscosa tribe. So trying to figure out where my connection was, whether it was trying to see if, like, do these mountains remind me of Kashmir? Does the gardens, those kinds of things. And then starting to sort of peel back, where do the connections actually lie for me?
You have this really nice line in there, which is something that I really identified with when you talk about diaspora's double sting. Something reminds you of home, but also that you're not there or can't go there. And I found that like it was so well expressed, this feeling of it's the exact same thing that attracts you is the same thing that kind of rejects you or reminds you that this is actually not home, at all. And you were saying where the town got its name from. What I also found interesting is that Thomas More writes this poem, having never been to Kashmir, having only imagined it as this sort of exotic locale. And then the judge who names the town has also never been to Kashmir. So it's this like double layer of accents of, someone's imagination about Kashmir and then someone's imagination on someone else's imagination of Kashmir, sort of these like levels of of being removed from a place and making it up. And there were many similarities I found and many intersections between your piece and May's piece. But this idea of the imaginary homeland, this idea of the place where we're far away from it, we make it up and then it becomes, because we're anticipating it in our imagination, it's this promised land. But then the more you dream about it, the more not just out of reach it becomes, but the more imaginary. And then again, you're like removed. It's like you have this, where you're talking about like Ithaca is not the lost island, it's the longing in the heart for the lost island. Can you talk about these levels of removal, May, of being several steps removed from home through all of these? Like, I imagined it as kind of like, we were talking about eyesight earlier, but the way that like a reflected image then becomes smaller and smaller in like a kind of mise en abîme. That's what it seemed to me like you were somehow talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been grappling with for a long time. My thinking about home, I think really, and I think I start the piece with this idea of because perhaps I moved away so young, it was just something that is just been in me, the sense that movement is part of the experience of home, leaving home, returning back to home. Sometimes, like I said, when I was young, it wasn't a sort of it wasn't a traumatic experience at all. But then when I was 19 and Kuwait was invaded and I wasn't in Kuwait at the time, and then that experience and returning back to a pretty devastated homeland was a traumatic experience. But then now I realize that this experience of leaving and not just leaving physically, but metaphorically, that distance that's created between yourself and the place that you define as home is something that just happens as a matter of course. Then for me as a writer of fiction, I'm always thinking then about how do I deal with that sense of, again, displacement or unfamiliarity. How do I reckon with it? How do I write about it? How do I think about it? Because home is something that I'm constantly returning to, whether I want to or not. This idea in my writing, it keeps coming back for whatever reason. And what I have lately come to kind of sense is that this imagined home that I'm writing about doesn't really exist anywhere apart from in my own writing or in my imagination or in my being. Part of it, as I write in the piece, has to do with aging. You know, the place that you grew up is no longer the place that is. People change, the places change, the politics change, people that you love die, places get demolished and disappear. So all of that is tied in with this sense of separation. But there is this longing still for that place that you grew up, that you have memories, that, you know, they still inhere in this place. And you see it in a certain light in the, you know, in the landscape that still exists. And that's the kind of thing that I wanted to explore because it's painful, it's poignant, but I also think it reflects what we're seeing around us, the devastation, you know, literally to people's homes in our region, whether Gaza most, you know, horrifically, but Syria, Iraq, you know, all of the different places, Lebanon. This is something that we live with here and have to deal with, you know, on real physical levels, not just metaphorical ones. And that was something that I wanted to continue to explore and think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea of like homes becoming devastated and moving away from and how does Nafeesa puts it? I actually made a note of it where it's this, you say something like people become made, people being disappeared, or like an entire people being made invisible, like that is something that is now happening again. It's now happening again in the world because you were comparing, you know, the genocide of Native Americans to what's happening in Palestine. And I was wondering actually if, yes, it is visible again, but hasn't that also been like an ongoing process of something that has been going on and maybe now definitely it's very different. It's being live streamed. It's something that we're looking at. But this idea of like people being made invisible, becoming dispossessed of their homes. And I really thought about it when I was reading Gabriel's piece because, you know, you were talking to Yazz Ahmed and, you know, and you talk about the legacy of jazz music as, you know, African American. It's a music of dispossession to a certain extent. You say how you know, the Sheik of Araby, this song, which is like very about this exoticized place, very much like the poem that Nafeesa talks about, the Thomas More poem, and then how suddenly when it is in the hands of these African American jazz musicians, suddenly it sounds completely different. And so, you know, I wonder if you can talk about home as music, as a kind of music, or finding home in music, the way and why you were intrigued by Yazz Ahmed in specific, and why you wanted to speak to her.
Yes, thank you so much, Lena. Yes, indeed. I think that really Arabic jazz has been, as a genre, it's been really kind of concerned with the homeland and ideas of, what is home and how to explore home, often when people are far from home, because I think it's clear that it's a music of migration and, from the kind of origins, which were in the 1950s in America. It was really kind of African American musicians like Ahmed Abdul Malik, who is, I think, the kind of progenitor of Arabic jazz. He claimed to be Sudanese, but he wasn't Sudanese, except in his identity. His parents came from the Caribbean. And then he was a double bass player. He started playing oud and studying oud and Arabic music as part of a kind of the embrace of African American musicians at the time of Islam. And he converted to Islam along with many other African American jazz musicians. And he was joined by immigrant Arab musicians, so musicians from Palestine and Syria. Jacques Ghanem is the name of the qanun player who joined him from Palestine. Um, and so it's a kind of at once like a seeking of an imagined homeland for Ahmed Abdul Malik of the kind of African and Arab world, and then an echo of a real homeland for these immigrant Arab musicians who came to America and joined this jazz band, which is amazing kind of cultural fusion there. And then moving forward now, I try and go through a brief history of Arabic jazz in my article, which, by the way, and I'm not the one to write this, but I think there's a history out there, a full history, because as a genre, it's really not been explored enough, and the history is amazing. The deeper you look into it, it's wonderful. Um, but taking this forward to Yaz, who's British Bahraini trumpet player. Um, her story in a way is kind of similar, even though there's so many cultural differences and differences of context. But she was, came from Bahrain, again, also left as a result of the Gulf War in the 90s when the region seemed to be becoming very unstable, and came to the UK. Her experience as an Arab child in the UK was one of bullying and racism actually from children, from her peers at school. And also being aware of the kind of cultural Orientalism, hostility towards Arabs and Islam. She's turned this many years later into a kind of wonderful cultural hybrid kind of bridge from the Arab world to jazz and Western music. And her most recent album, A Paradise in the Hold, really explores specifically Bahraini music and traditions and the pearl divers and the sea shanties that were, existing in the Gulf, and then blends it with this kind of quintessentially Western art form of jazz, which is, it's a great kind of bridge between cultures.
You were talking about the history of jazz. I was really intrigued actually reading your piece where you talk about, I forgot the name of the band who have a stopover in Egypt, and then there's like a brigadier general who also happens to be a jazz drummer
Yeah.
who somehow it's this through this coincidence, this fusion is created. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it was Sun Ra, Sun Ra,
Yes.
who's like the most kind of I mean, Sun Ra claimed to be from outer space. He always maintained that that kind of legend about himself, and just the most kind of psychedelic and kind of amazing spiritual jazz music, as anyone who's listened to Sun Ra knows, comes to Egypt in the 70s and strikes up this really unlikely friendship with, as you say, like a military guy, Saleh Rajab, his name. And Saleh's music just it's amazing. It's a kind of mixture of big band jazz and kind of space spiritual jazz and Arabic music. I link it in my article if anyone's interested.
Yeah, I just found that a really fascinating story, and it just like made me think about the way that coincidences, accidents, mistakes, coming upon certain things create these kind of incredible fusions, and the way that a lot of, I places in the global south, or whether it's like, different oppressed or colonized peoples creating connections together without necessarily going through Europe as the conduit between them, like having these, and and that's also what I thought about a lot looking at your piece, Nafeesa, which is how you immediately kind of went there. And then the history that you ended up exploring, was not about the town of Kashmir itself, but, you talk about the Wenatchee Indian Territory. And again, like I said, you have all of these layers of colonialism, the colonialism of home, the colonialism of here. And what I really appreciate about it is you implicate yourself in that. You know, you say that you yourself living in the United States, you being able to be there, you have also benefited from that. And I always find that very it's a very necessary thing, you know, of implicating oneself or looking at the ways in which one can be implicated. And so I just wanted to point out that this was like another thing that I really liked about your piece. But for myself, you talk a lot about, you know, in the beginning, you have this line where you say, when writing about Kashmir, you must listen to the silences, and you say that this is your mentor who told you that. I would I would really like you to talk about that, but before you do, I also then realized that there are different forms of silence that you also talk about in your piece. And I really like this line where you say about going to Colville, you go to the, you know, the reservations, and you say, I had chats with people, but I'm not going to tell you what they are. So can you talk a little bit about this, of you drawing our attention to silence, or about things that are unsaid and that you don't want us to know, right? Like you're creating the shape around them, but you're very deliberately saying, I'm not going to fill in the silence or explain it.
Sure. I think, you know, it's interesting coming out of, you know, having been a journalist for so many years, the idea of on the record, off the record, you know, what gets said. And then, you know, when you know someone's lying to you, or when you know, the whole truth is not being conveyed, as we see, you know, in many ways these days. So that also, that line, when I talk about a mentor had said, you know, pay attention, listen to the silences. And I remember at that time I'd been doing interviews with people who had been tortured and political prisoners in Kashmir from the 1960s. So, and also when you're talking about these things have been going on continuously, it can be from so many places, you know, that have been under colonialism, and so many, you know, and I think that's one of the big things for me that's of interest, is seeing how these things are not just of the past, right? And that's what the indigenous woman who I quote in the piece, Mary Bickbull Lewis, she's a Wenatchee of the Wenatchee tribe, and she says colonization continues to impact our lives, you know, just so to understand that as well. So I remember, you know, interviewing some people, and, you know, when you start to ask them about the kinds of torture, or the kinds of things that they have gone through, and this is from like 60, 70 years ago, not even talking about the 90s or what's happening now in Kashmir. And it was being able to learn to think, okay, well, I don't have the whole picture. So what actually happened, you know? And I think I always wanted to be like, I need to get it on, you know, need to get all the details. So understanding then, how do we fill those silences? Are there other sources, other ways that we can understand? And these are involuntary silences, right? Like these are ways in which sometimes they can be imposed upon us. And, you know, feeling that way sometimes, even sometimes living in the US. And then I think when I talk about going to Colville, which is the reservation where 12 tribes were basically removed from their homelands and, you know, made to live on the Colville Reservation. That's actually what it was called by the US government, the Indian Removal Policy. And so going there, and when they told me I wouldn't be able to do on the record interviews, but I did talk to people. And, you know, I talk about the idea of feeling disappointed about that, but then understanding, also talking to them about the history of extraction, repatriating bodies that were stolen. I mean, to the extent that, you know, when you talk about removal from home, removal from homeland, it was even like their remains. It wasn't just that the land was taken, but like their actual remains. I have a case in there that I mentioned actually out of Kashmir, and some of the details, 'cause I couldn't put everything in there, but it was like the remains were sold along with the objects that they were buried with, like copper necklaces or other ornaments. So just like that level, right? And so understanding what it means then to have the agency to impose silences as opposed to it being imposed upon you. And so I think that was something that I was also very interested in, because so often I had looked at, well, what's really happening here? You know, maybe there's silences going on that I need to listen to, but also listening to the idea of people who are choosing to impose a silence on their by their own accord.
You talk about it as a form of sovereignty also, actually, you know, when you go to the museum and you say there are certain things that they didn't talk about or certain things that they were silent, and then the way that you sort of console yourself being disappointed is saying, well, that is a form of sovereignty as well, to be able, you know, to decide when to be silent. And that really made me think, you know, it made me think about you know, like there's so many interviews that we see, like I'm going to use the case of Palestine now. And I've seen several interviews where people are saying, I have nothing to say. We've said everything that has to be said. And, you know, I don't want to say anything anymore because I'm talking and there's no difference that is being made, you know? And yes, I feel like sovereignty, you know, silence is a form of sovereignty, or choosing when to keep silent. And, but at the same time, you know, this um, not being able to find the words, um, trying to articulate this exactly, but like the fact that you are constantly put on the spot, having to advocate for yourself, having to talk about, having to make a case for your own humanity. It seemed to me that the way that I took it was that you're also allowed to maintain like a sovereignty of self and a dignity of self when you are not constantly put upon, you know, and having to speak and to advocate for yourself. So that was just something that I was thinking about. And there's so many parallels with Palestine, obviously, not just because of the genocide and forcible removal, and this fact that we're now watching, we are looking at what the world looks like for a people who have been ethnically cleansed, you know. But so much of what you talk about initially is like grounded in landscape and grounded in land, and you talk about land. And May, you speak about land is like home is the land, it's not the state. And yet again, you know, in when it comes to the question of Palestine, what's being fought for is the land, but also the right to a state. And can you talk a little bit about that? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you know, I was also thinking about how much of it, like possessing the land or saying that home is the land, is of course is a way of throwing off the shackles of colonization, you know, and refusing to be colonized. But at the same time, is it a kind of consolation as well for not having a state, like not being able to legally be in your own land, which is something that, you know, Nafeesa talks about it, you know, in the end, it's like because they couldn't establish legal rights, or they weren't allowed to establish legal rights, that was a huge way that people were dispossessed. So
Yes, I mean, just in short, like a short answer, in a sense, yes. I mean, it is a loss. It is a loss to let go of your ability to claim statehood. But also, I'm writing again. I can't speak freely where I am right now, but I'm writing from a place where there is such disappointment in what's happening currently, and so that there is the sense of futility and powerlessness and fear. And all of that together, and in thinking about how I wanted to write this essay, you know, I was really trying to think for myself, what do you do in the face of an inability even to protest? What is it then that it comes down to? And for me, it was, well, I still care about the land. The land still matters, you know, the land where, and I mean, it is really for me where my mother is buried. You know, it may not be the same for everyone, but that I can't let that go. You know, I can't let go my claim to that. And that's not a lot. I mean, you know, but when everything feels like it's being stripped, and again, what I'm going through, or what's happening, is nothing compared to what's happening in Palestine and to Palestinians. And so I think that, you know, for me to say I'm too afraid to, you know, to kind of protest, or to say, again, that's the position that I happen to occupy at the moment. It may not be the one that I occupy forever, but that's really what I was thinking about, is the basic claim to the land that can't be taken away from you. But is it kind of giving something up? I think yes, it is. I think yes, it is. And I don't think we can afford to do that. I really don't. Not in the world we live in today. And then, you know, the way, you know, what Nafeesa writes about the end of this giving up, or not giving up, but, you know, not being able to get anything back, even if you fight for it, which, you know, Nafeesa writes about all the different ways in which the indigenous people did fight. The end is not pretty. You know, it doesn't end well. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of disappointment. I tried to end in the essay on a note of some optimism. I think I remain deeply optimistic despite everything, you know, but it was a struggle. It was a struggle to come to that kind of conclusion, you know. And yeah, I completely agree with you that you are letting something go, something fundamental.
I was going to ask you about that, actually, that you end on like a very redemptive note in the end. And I to me, it's very much encapsulated also by something that Nafeesa wrote, which is solidarity as a kind of belonging, not to a place, but to each other. And
That's
it's
right.
this idea that the consolation of not finding home in a physical place is finding home not just in like-minded communities, but in communities like you speak about this, May, that are like cross-border communities. They're like ethical communities, moral communities, like-minded communities, you know. And so and you know what Gabriel writes about is like an actual you know, it's like solidarity made manifest, right? Where you have musicians who are working together in many different genres and many different languages and all of that. And it seems to me like that is, you know, when we ask about what can solidarity look like in that forum that Nafeesa writes about, music feels like such a concrete answer to it, you know? So I guess I would like each of you to comment on this idea that, you know, that solidarity is a kind of belonging and can form a kind of home. And what consolation do we find in that, or what actual practical material effect can this have when dispossession is, again, we're watching dispossession unfold like live stream on our telephones. And I think, you know, the genocide is both the genocide, but it's also a metaphor for the unraveling of the world, you know, as we watch all of its rules erode, you know, or we become witness to the fact that they never mattered in the first place. And so I think, what does solidarity mean as a form of belonging in these circumstances, you know, for each of you? Who would
I
like
might
to be Gabriel? Thank
I
you
might go
for being the
first, as
volunteer. Yeah.
that's all right, as I didn't speak for a second time. Um, I want to kind of link, as you were talking and asking a question, I was thinking, you know, my article is about music, and it's not my, you know, subject area, but it's something I'm passionate about. But you know, writing about it was something new to me. Um, and I mean, linking this to the genocide in Gaza and what's happening now with musicians, and in the city of London, there's been so much kind of solidarity, you know, from the music scene, of different kind of genres and different types of music with different audiences, which is wonderful. And I know at the same time that music is something that many of my Palestinian friends just their pleasure in art and music has just decreased since the start of the genocide. And watching these things on our screens that we carry around with us in our pockets, and we have access to all times of day, and we're continuously seeing the most horrific images that we've seen in our lives. It really kind of it's difficult for music to cut through that and arts to cut through that. And I think that now today, honest music and the best kind of music that is in solidarity with Palestine and that I've seen being created by Palestinian musicians is something that it's not pleasurable. It challenges us. It challenges us and it reminds us of the genocide. It draws it to our attention and it draws it to the audience's attention rather than being something which is easy to listen to, pleasant on the ear. And I think that is also, although of course I find jazz immensely pleasurable, there is always an element, I think, if you look at jazz from kind of the 1940s and 50s onwards, when it became such a dominant African diasporic art form, there's always the note of discordance in jazz. There's always the reminder of the suffering and the past and the present. Um, those are my thoughts on that, really, linking that to arts and music in particular.
Thank you. Nafeesa or Mai, do you?
I guess I'll just say, because it's that line that I have about the idea of solidarity as a form of belonging, and I think that came from, since the piece I wrote is so much about sort of the journey of like what I'm discovering as I'm going, because I had started out thinking that I was going to find a sense of belonging or a sense of recognition in Kashmir because they would know something about Kashmir. And, as I write in the piece about how little that anyone actually, especially younger people, knew or had any sense, let alone understanding or knowing anything about the conflict or any, let alone just the place or that it existed. I had a lot of funny interactions with young people telling me, well, actually, so it used to be called Kashmir. It was named after an Indian tribe but it was spelled with a K, but then it changed into Kashmir. So anyway, there were, those kinds of things that there was humor in that, but then also it was like another reminder that I don't belong and that I am not, that this is not necessarily, a place that I can feel some kind of affinity with in that sense. So I think when going to the reservation also, I think what often happens is that we can continue to romanticize Indigenous peoples and like what they have gone through and stuff. And instead it created this kind of really wanting to go back to my own home and like my own, kinds of understanding and traditions, but in a way that after being able to see how much actually we had in common and like common struggles and common histories. And like I note in the piece or the images of seeing, reading about the Wenatchee displaced, and I did that, and I described that drive, which they did on foot, on wagon, on horse, the families leaving and weeping that they won't be ever be able to go home. And how could I not think of all the images that I've been seeing, on cart, on horse, on cars, people in Gaza fleeing. And so I think being able to find those points of, actually where like struggles can kind of, you find those where out of that kind of solidarity, I think, and in places, that I think talking to some of the indigenous folks, they didn't know about Kashmir necessarily either at all. But when we started talking about things, we're like, wait a minute, that sounds familiar. Wait, that sounds, and so there was this really powerful kind of understanding. And I think that's why I felt like, oh, maybe this is a kind of belonging. And actually to play into Gabriel's piece, When I was in my early 20s in grad school, you talk about the movement, the early kind of Arab immigrants coming from, to modern Lebanon and Syria in New York. And I remember I was so drawn to that. I translated the poetry of Nasib Arida in his book Al-Arwah Al-Ha'ira, The Restless Souls. And I wrote about sort of the idea of like his concept of home as I saw it as being internal. I'm a Kashmiri, like I have no, I didn't have anything necessarily in common. I thought that was really cool in your piece where you talk about that interplay culturally and how much I gained from their exploration of home sitting in Brooklyn or in the Lower East Side in New York. So just another way of like how solidarity can also inspire how we understand our own, you know, concepts and understanding of land and home.
And I mean, I guess one of the things that in Nafeesa's piece that really just struck me, I think you mentioned it, Lena, where she says the world looking away indifferently, this feeling of imminent vanishing. But and the world is, you do have the sense that the world looks away. No one's looking at all the corners of the universe and all the things that are going wrong and the incredible devastation and all of that. And I was writing in the face of that. In the face of that, what is it that we have? We can turn away, which is what we feel like the world is turning away and we're all split and divided, or we can turn toward each other, which has happened and has been happening. I agree with Gabriel, the power of art, the power of music and writing, it feels like it's almost nothing, and Lena, you cited the sense of exhaustion on the part of so many Palestinians, but people having to always tell the story, keep repeating. And then there comes a point of complete and utter exhaustion where you don't want to speak and you have the sense that art is futile. And yet we persist. We persist in doing it. We persist in speaking up, maybe silent for a time, and then you speak up again, and then you turn toward each other in those forms of solidarity or activism or just friendship or some connection that we have, an email, somebody writes to you about something that you wrote or something that you did. And that's all we have. I mean, it may not change the world, but it may. The thing is that there can be a cumulative effect and it feels so slow and it feels so impossible. But I think even still, we're witnessing that. We're witnessing it happening. There have been transformations in the way people look at what's happening in Palestine. And it shouldn't have taken this, and there are, again, no words. Why should this have happened for people to finally wake up if they are indeed waking up? And yet, again, I still see the possibility of home in each other, if we give it a chance.
I mean, I do find that a beautiful answer, and I do, you're right. It's very easy to be cynical, and it's very easy to say, this is not having an effect as fast as I would like it or as dramatic as I would like it. Therefore, maybe the entire effort is futile. But I think what's really interesting about, writing or, music or any form of art is it always presupposes a reader or a listener or, somebody out there, it's the self-conscious act, but on the other side of it, there's always like it's like an intrinsic faith that somebody is out there listening. Otherwise, you would not be doing what you're doing. And, it would exist as a thought. It wouldn't be expressed like, outside the body. So as soon as you put it outside the body, whether it's a piece of music or, a painting or whatever it is, there is the, it's beyond the mere hope that somebody will listen. It's almost like a faith that there is somebody out there who's about to listen to it. And I think for me that it's sort of right in that small space that we can, between writer and reader or between speaker and listener or whatever it is, that we are relying on one another to tell each other stories. So it's not the story itself, it's the telling of the story to the listener. We all try to console ourselves and hold on to things, right? Because otherwise it just feels so incredibly bleak. And but actually, I don't want to end on a bleak note. I would rather say, like, you guys all ended on these very high notes, and I think that they're all very earned. That's what I really appreciated, is that you come to a point, all three of you, where there's something very redemptive in what you say, but it's also earned. It's not this like kind of empty optimism. It's an optimism that's earned out of um, this suffering, or yeah.
Lena, I have a question for you before we take questions. Hi, everyone. I'm back. I'm an editor at the Markaz Review. You said, quote, that Palestinians or Gazans realize, quote, they never mattered in the first place. And you're not Palestinian, but you're Lebanese, and you've just returned to Beirut after being gone for a while. And Beirut has been under the bombs as Gaza has been under the bombs. How do you feel as a returning devalued person? I mean, you see that the West doesn't really care about the people in Gaza, although in the last week suddenly there's people are having second thoughts in the EU and in the UK and even in the US. Um, how do you feel returning to Beirut and also realizing that that Palestinians never mattered in the first place? Well, doesn't that extend to everybody else in the Arab world?
I feel devalued when I'm abroad. When I return, I feel valued again, because I am in a place where um, everything I say resonates and it matters. And it's not about, trying to advocate for myself. I can just kind of exist as I am, the same way everybody else here exists as they are in community. And it's in returning that I realize, like, oh, it's abroad that I'm living this half life where I exist vis-a-vis the West and how they view me and how they view people like me and where I come from. Whereas here, it's like you can just kind of shut them out. And the central point, the reference point is here. It's not there. They might as well not exist, except in there. So even, that they're the ones sort of sending the bombs and causing the problems and all of these things, I think you're not devalued in the same way when you are here as you are there.
So when you're walking around Beirut today, for example, you feel like this incredible sense of solidarity with everyone else?
Yeah, slash absolute annoyance, like with the way people drive or the way, the things or the loud noises or etc. But I mean, people are returned in the fullness of their humanity in their own communities. Like, when you're looking at places from abroad, like let's say if you look at Palestine or if you look at Lebanon, it just becomes like people become so one note. They're either like victims and you're supposed to feel sorry for them and you feel bad for them, or they're criminals. But here it's like, again, once you're up close, it is, yes, you feel a sense of solidarity. You also feel annoyance because people disappoint you in different ways, but they have like a full range of who they are, as opposed to, again, like for me, fundamentally, it's like the West is no longer the reference point. I'm not mediated, and that's what I was trying to say earlier. Maybe it wasn't articulated quite so well, because I have to say today I've just been running around all day trying to find a place with internet to be able, not that internet, there isn't internet here, but just a quiet place where I would be able to do this. So I'm just, but that having that lens of the West, or having that lens of Europe through which everything is refracted, and then, like so you're not seeing things head on, you're not seeing them clearly. I think that doesn't happen when you kind of exclude them and they don't exist anymore for you here, except in their effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Looks like you have a question in the Q&A.
Let's see. Okay, so it's we have a question from I'm gonna say Real Bachit. So first of all, thank you so much for this roundtable. Thank you guys. As a Sudanese writer who's trying to publish a novel that explores these very themes and the effects of displacement in the wake of the current events, this has been a truly enriching discussion. And my question is, what sources or books did you keep going back to while trying to express these difficult themes in fiction and nonfiction? Thank you. So yeah, I think that's a good question. Can you each speak to, like, we were talking about the power of art, or we were talking about, what are some works that you keep coming back to that you feel flesh out these themes that are, important to your work?
I mean, so I mentioned a bunch of them in the essay itself. So, Edward Said is someone I will always go back to on these issues. He writes about them so eloquently, as we know. But in my essay, in a way, is sort of tracing some of these influences for me. And, I go through Joyce and his relationship to Ireland, Walter Benjamin, although he doesn't always write about home per se, but he has a lovely collection about his childhood in Berlin that has been important to my thinking about some of these issues. I mentioned Homer's The Odyssey, so that's a sort of early interesting take on home and returns and so on. So, and then Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, but also Imaginary Homelands, which is a collection that deals with a number of the essays deal with home, especially the title essay. Just a short list.
Nafeesa or Gabriel, do you have any book recommendations or?
I can, I guess, sort of a recent book that, has come out by the Kashmiri writer, actually, Zahid Rafiq, called The World with Its Mouth Open. It's a new short story collection from Tin House. So I bring that up more as like a recent reference because so much of it is about the people and sort of the experience under, oppression and occupation, all those things. So being able to turn the lens back onto, that experience as opposed to, he talks a lot about like taking Kashmir out of the book, but actually what he's talking about is, really radically putting the focus on the people as opposed to, all the other, lenses and gazes and all that kind of thing. So that's something I think that I've been thinking about a lot after reading that recently as a point of reference.
Yeah, wow, amazing contributions. I think for my article, I mean I do cite literature in there, but it was quite unusual. And I normally write about texts in my work, and for once I was writing about music, which is quite different to do. I'm just going to mention the name of the book that I'm reading at the moment because I also tend to forget books that I read, and the one that I'm reading at the moment is often the most important to me, which is an academic book, and it actually also, the title references music, but it's not really about music. It's called The Brass Band of the King, Armenians in Ethiopia by Boris Adjemian, which is, it's an amazing story connecting Palestine, Armenia, and Ethiopia, going back centuries. The title is about the Emperor of Ethiopia, Rastafari, when he came to Jerusalem and adopted 40 Armenian orphans to take back to Ethiopia, who became the first national orchestra of Ethiopia. And it's just a wonderful story about kind of cross cultures and the richness that comes with that. And I think it's so important to hold on to those stories because it's just under attack. And anyone who's in the UK right now will know how much it's becoming part of the discourse and how overwhelmingly depressing that is. And just it's important to hold on to those stories and to know it's not a recent story. It's actually a centuries or millennia-old story. It's so important to highlight.
You
Brass
mean
Band of the King,
anti-immigrant,
if anyone wants to check it out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. So sorry, go ahead, Jordan.
No, fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversation with all of you, and look forward to meeting you in London, Kuwait, or LA the next time in any of those places. In fact, I'll be in London next week. The Markaz Review is going to be active in London, actually, as of tomorrow night. Our literary editor, Malu Halassa, has curated an exhibit called The Art of the Palestinian Poster, which is opening tomorrow, the 23rd in London at P21 Gallery. So she'll be there introducing the show, and I'll be checking it out next week when I get there. And then we'll be giving a writing workshop called Writing from the Center of the World next Saturday, the 31st of May. But I'll be in London next week. So for those of you who are there and you want to meet up and reinvent the world, or, smoke a joint, or no, I'm kidding. Or maybe not, I don't know. You want to do something illicit, or you want to protest. In fact, if there's a pro-Palestine protest scheduled for next Saturday during the day, I'm available. Please let me know. I'll be there with my flag or with my body, either one. What else can I say to you guys? We've got some more events coming up this week, or actually at the end of the month. We have the book group, the May Book Club, coming up with this Honey Hunger by Zahran Al-Qassami, and the translator is Marilyn Booth. Our book group is a very, what's the Arabic word for comfort and family? Gemütlichkeit. It's a very chummy group. So if you like reading and you're into talking about books and literature, even if you haven't read the book, you should come to the book club, which is always the last Saturday of the month. And if you're in Beirut, look up Lena Munzer. Or if you're in Kuwait City, you can look up Mai Al-Nakib. And if you're in Montpellier, France, look me up. And I guess if you have to go to LA, you have to look up Nafeesa Syeed. Personally, thank all of you for joining us in the conversation.
Thank you so much to all three of you. Thank you for your beautiful pieces. Thank you for coming tonight, in your respective time zones and having this conversation together. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure that our audience enjoyed it as well. And on behalf of the Markaz Review, thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.